Yeah, hello everybody. Actually, Thomas, John, and I have been going back and forth for a while on this topic, and I actually think John and I have spoken. I don't know that I'm actually the one to be the moderator. I think all of us bring radically different points of view as a vendor. I'm an ex-operator and now a lobbyist for our trade association. John has operator chops and consultancy chops in this space. So I think the first thing first is why don't we do some quick intros? John, if you could just give a quick overview of how you're approaching the topic.
Thank you, Michael. So yes, I'm John Booth, Managing Director of Carbon Through IT Limited. We work very closely with the European Union Joint Research Centre on the EU Code of Conduct for Data Centres Energy Efficiency Best Practices. We provided expert content into the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act Assessment Framework from the EU JRC. We're also working very closely with the UK government on energy efficiency and sustainability matters.
Yeah, great. Thomas?
Hi, I'm Tom Verghese. I work for Enersys as a business development manager. Enersys are a large battery company supplying into data centers, but many other industries from submarines, military, space, forklift trucks, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I think the reason why I'm on the panel today is I'm hopefully going to give a little bit of insight into the new battery regulations and how they may impact the data center sphere and why they are constructed as they are.
I think before we go anywhere, at a high level, if you think back to the prep sessions and the emails that we've been sending each other, Thomas and John, is there sort of like a sort of high level, like where are we and is it bad? Is it good? Is it just life? Kind of position how you're seeing this as you're engaging your clients. It'd be really interesting if one of you could start on that.
Well, shall I go first on that? So I think, but fundamentally, sustainability. A lot of the new regulation is being driven by sustainability. We have made sustainability-based promises to both our customers and our investors. So I think at its best, regulation can be used to enforce those promises, our sustainability claims and goals. So from that point of view, I think regulation should be seen as a good thing.
As in it forces transparency, zero accusations of greenwashing, etc.
And verification, for all companies within the space, gives everybody a level playing field in terms of what we're offering, allowing people to compare and contrast. I mean, from a simple battery point of view, we put the voltage and the capacity of the battery on the side of the battery, and somebody can take any one of those batteries and check it wherever they are in the world. If you start to put the carbon value on the side of a battery, yes, it's very important. Yes, it's critical to our goals as a company, but it becomes much harder to verify that number. So regulatory oversight is a good way of doing that.
I think, John, if I pick up something that you said in your introduction, the work you've done with the JRC and in the building out of the EU Code of Conduct, which basically is fundamentally driving a set of international standards. In a sense, do you see this as just sort of the inevitable end game, or do you and your clients look at this differently?
I remember when the Code of Conduct was first mooted as a thing back in 2008, 2009. We didn't actually get involved in it until 2010, but we're building on the excellent work from Zal and Liam Newcomb and from the British Computer Society's Data Center Specialist Group in conjunction with DEFRA and the European Union JRC. And I remember Liam telling me that, the whole practices were going to be or form part of some regulatory directive in the future. And it's taken 14 years for them to become actual kind of not specifically the code of conduct itself, but some of the best practices are contained within the various regulatory elements, such as the Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act, which is effectively for green financing for data centers. It's mentioned in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it's mentioned in the Energy Efficiency Directive. So it was kind of inevitable that the code of conduct was going to form part of that. And I think the code of conduct has been very useful because it's a peer-reviewed document. There's no one organization that's taken control of it. There is a lot of discussion and debate between the various stakeholders to come up with a series of best practices, which, in essence, are common sense. We don't want to waste energy. We want to make sure that our data centers are energy efficient and sustainable, and they are actually delivering digital services to internal and external customers at the lowest possible cost, dependent on that organization's risk profile. And I believe that the Code of Conduct is a strategic and cultural change document that can be delivered, and it will change the way that organizations actually operate, providing data center and IT services. I think, but there has been some confusion about that message. So people don't really understand it as being a cultural and strategic change tool. They see it as a series of best practices that they can cherry pick. And I don't think that was the original intention of the best practices. The original intention of the best practices was to work your way through them and to develop and deliver energy efficient services, as I said, in line with your company's risk profile or organization. And I think it's a shame that a lot of organizations don't see it that way.
Yeah.
Perhaps they should start to see it that way, because it will save money and it will save energy. And that's ultimately the end goal of all EU climate regulation, is to save money and save energy.
And I think actually that second point needs to be thought about, that save energy. I think at a systemic level, the big fear in the European Union with the green digital transition is that the investments required to move all industries onto, one, the electricity grid, two, a renewable electricity grid. I think some home truths have come in, which is that that grid can't quite handle it yet. And so efficiency becomes as important as sustainability for that very problem.
I would agree. Energy efficiency is cited by the International Energy Agency as being the first fuel. Do more with less.
Yeah.
And
And Thomas, I want to come back to you on this idea of labeling a product, which ultimately represents the embedded energy or carbon that's in that product. Whereas I think John and I have the experience more of the sort of scope 1, scope 2 of the operating energy and carbon of operations. But the three are ultimately linked. Energy went into, at some level, scope 1 and scope 2 into building these products. So you mentioned the difficulty of writing a law that accurately captures the scope 3 emissions for your industry. What do you believe your industry has been able to do to solve that problem?
So I think that the difficulties really go around promoting long life of the product. So the battery directive, one of the things it's really trying to do is promote the circular economy. So effectively, that's right from the suppliers into the people who make the batteries, to ensure that their carbon, for example, a lead acid battery, the lead's got to come from somewhere, and there's a carbon associated with digging that out the ground in some cases. So that is all recorded. Then our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as manufacturers are relatively, I think they're reasonably well established as of today, and putting them on is reasonably straightforward. But what you want to do for the end users is also to promote long life of the product through its life. So you don't just want to buy a battery based on, oh, that's a small level of carbon associated with the manufacturer if it only lasts 1 year. You want the battery itself to last 10 years. And if that means 10 or 20% more carbon, then that can be seen as an acceptable trade-off. So one of the things that we are talking with the JRC about is how that is defined, the carbon value that goes on the side of the battery. And effectively, it'll be defined as something like carbon associated with manufacture divided by the number of discharges it is expected to be used for, the kilowatt hours it is specified to be used for through its life. And then that promotes then long life in application. How the detail of exactly how that is being done is still being discussed, but it's that balance between, yes, low carbon associated with manufacture, yes, use of recycled materials, and again, if that means more carbon, then so be it, because you're having to use these recycled materials, which again should be promoted. But also, you want the battery to have a long life. And I think the other thing to remember is the battery regulation is really being driven by EV vehicles. So when we're saying having a long life, when the regulations were first mooted, that effectively meant a lot of mileage in your car. And how that is translated into other industries is kind of where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
And on that point, I think, and this is not really mentioned that often, but if you're manufacturing anything in a high carbon grid environment, then the embodied carbon is going to be higher than an equivalent product that's manufactured in a low carbon energy grid. So, for an example, if you take a UPS that's manufactured in France against a UPS that's manufactured in, say, Poland, there is going to be a significant difference in the amount of embodied carbon in that particular product. Now, the danger is going to be when people, if there is a carbon tax associated with that embodied carbon, who is going to buy the product from Poland? Because it's going to be cheaper and probably less carbon intensive to buy that product from France. Now, that has long-term social impacts, because clearly the company that's in the high carbon environment is going to have probably not going to be able to sell its products, and there's going to be people that work for that company, and those people will have families, and there'll be whole ecosystems that are based upon servicing that factory, or schools, shopping, all that sort of stuff. And this all depends on the decarbonisation of that particular country. So I think we should be focusing on more decarbonisation efforts rather than perhaps seeking to impact on regulation on products.
When you say we, you mean we as citizens and society, not we as data center operators.
Yeah, I'm a little bit wider than that. So yes, the commission and the local national governments need to be looking at how to decarbonise their grid rather than seeking to regulate companies that are just doing business as usual stuff.
And I think perhaps this is where I think this topic becomes so important, because it's going to lead to an ultimate economic burden of an industry that's more regulated in one region versus another region in the world. Because ultimately this issue is, how does Europe compare to other regions? So my fear is that, Thomas, you've raised the point that regulations in theory release you from certain responsibilities of proof, because as long as you meet regulatory requirements, you are able to use that in your sales and marketing. And you then made another point, which I think can be challenged, which is the regulation helps drive behavior. And I've just heard John's example where regulation may drive unintended behavior, either primary, people try to work the regulation to their benefit, or indirectly, as in there's a secondary knock-on effect. And I guess my question on this, and this is something that the members of the European Data Center Association were pushing long and hard over the previous European administration around the issues of taxonomy, CSRD, and eventually the Energy Efficiency Directive, is with an industry that's already obsessed with efficiency because that's how we make our profit. Will regulations create a net benefit, e.g., you drive better behavior that more than offsets the unintended consequences? And so, John, I don't know if you have an opinion. The members of the European Data Center Association recognize that regulation is one here, and two, if done right, can drive good behavior, but may three drive bad behavior. Do you see issues like the Poland issue just raised? And then Thomas, I wouldn't mind if you gave a comment on that as well.
I think
Mhm.
that ultimately data centers are quite sticky. Customers are quite sticky within data centers. It costs a lot to move a complete IT stack out of one co-location facility and move it to another. So they're going to have to think long and hard from a customer perspective if they want to, reduce their overall. I mean, after all, these companies are going to be reporting under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And in certain jurisdictions, they will have a cloud co-location instance that's going to be higher than maybe another cloud co-location instance in another decarbonized grid. So are they going to move those services from data center A to data center B? Potentially no, because the cost of migration is high and very disruptive. And they should be putting pressure on the local government or jurisdiction to decarbonize the grid so that there's some sort of equality, in my opinion. But companies will start to look, if there is some sort of carbon tax, companies will start to do that. And they'll have to do the pros and cons of moving from data center A to data center B, remembering that it's not just the energy costs and sustainability efforts that determine where a customer locates. It's latency, it could end up being sovereignty issues as well. So it's a tricky situation, and caution, I think, needs to be applied. And I'm not convinced that there's a lot of caution in a lot of companies. They do tend to do knee-jerk reactions to things. And I think this needs to be a very carefully considered problem to discuss.
And I think that knee-jerk reaction, Thomas, might feed into you, which is, a company basically says, oh, I have to hit sustainability metrics. Well, who ticks a box? Oh, this company fits within that regulation that ticks a box. That's, I think, where you were being positive on this will drive behavior. But
Mhm.
one, do you agree? And two, do you see unintended consequences of a regulation that wasn't
Yeah.
quite thought out?
Yes, it's an interesting use of the word unintended. I think in the previous caller or talk, they used the phrase, if we build it, they will come. And I think certainly the regulations that we're involved in now have some of that to it. They're trying to use regulation to change behavior, and to drive innovation. So the classic example in our industry is lithium ion recycling. That they are clearly in that setting goals for the use of recycled material within lithium ion batteries, where perhaps that technology certainly doesn't commercially exist fully at the moment. And they're asking industries to innovate in order to hit those targets. So when challenged, for example, about the Poland versus France versus Scandinavia issue, I suspect that, without putting words in their mouth, but I suspect the EU would say something like, well, it's up to you to, as an industry, to innovate. It's up to the industry, the battery manufacturers within Europe. It's up to you to innovate so that you are the greenest globally, and therefore people aren't going abroad. So yes, we support regulation to drive our sustainability goals and for verification, but certainly now we're in a place where regulation is also being used to drive innovation, and I'm not certain that's always a good place to go.
Okay. If I look specifically at the Energy Efficiency Directive, which firmly calls out the data center operator and has a whole section of regulations on, at the beginning, a set of reporting metrics, but we know where this is going to go. They're going to lead to a set of minimum operating standards, or a labeling structure, good, bad, ugly, whatever you want to call it. I guess, as we look at this, we're realizing, well, it's too late. The egg has been cracked. We have to make an omelet out of this. But the reality of it is that there probably are some logical ways for us to engage policymakers on building these rules correctly. And these are things like, the definition of power utilization effectiveness was meant to be self-reflective, and it was meant for a company to use OpEx or CapEx investments and measure improvement over time against an existing estate, not to compare my data center to yours. And I feel like this is going to require us to step up and rehash these. And so we are as an industry body looking to these regulations saying, okay, are there international norms and standards or best practices? Code of conduct, EN 50600, ISO 50001 or 30134. Are there industry definitions that we can recommend? And I feel like that's our way to engage as a trade association.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, as you grapple with the issue of how to measure embodied carbon with batteries, or John, as you look at other issues that may regulate data centers, such as the high GWP number for and taxonomy, are there things we should be lobbying for to make sure that these regulations don't drive bad behavior?
Well, I think the first thing is that the regulators and policymakers need to listen to the stakeholder groups that they convene to talk about these various things. I mean, I was on that stakeholder group, and we discussed using the EN 5600 4-X ISO 30134 metrics, PUE, RE, etc. And we knew that the industry is aware of them, slow to adopt, but aware of them. So that was pretty good. We were a bit disappointed when they raised the threshold from 100 kilowatts to 500 kilowatts, because that basically took a lot of telco, smaller POP facilities out of the reported structure. And humans, excuse me, shh,
That's
my
okay.
dogs are
I've
having a
got two as
fight on the
well.
sofa, so I'm sorry about that. I think at the end of the day, regulation comes about from market failure or perceived market failure. Now, I'm not convinced that that's particularly prevalent in our sector, because I think we are probably one of the most innovative sectors working in the field of decarbonisation and energy efficiency anywhere. I don't think there's anybody to touch us. We are very strongly focused on building very energy efficient buildings, providing digital services. We just happen to be caught in a kind of Jevons paradox type of thing, that the more efficient we make our facilities, the more people want to use digital services. And we know that there is cloud growth, there is the AI bombshell that's hit recently. But some of these regulations, I think, are to drive out legacy facilities that aren't particularly efficient. They're of an age where they were built, before anything was thought about energy efficiency. And perhaps that's where the focus is. It's to move people out from inefficient facilities into newer facilities. And as you quite rightly say, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And perhaps the breaking of the eggs is to move digital services from on-premise, very badly managed, overcooled, over-engineered legacy facilities into some of the newer energy efficient, sustainable, well-managed facilities. And I think that the EU has got track record on this, right? So back in when they launched the Large Combustion Plant Directive to reduce the emissions coming from coal-fired power stations, I'm sure there were plenty of coal-fired power station providers that were saying, hey, we're a coal-fired power station. We provide gigawatts of electricity. They're never going to shut us down. Well, guess what, boys? They shut you down. And I think the same thing could apply to, data centers that are over a certain PUE number. And I think that's where we're going to go with this.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because that may be probably one of the biggest fundamental risks that we should all recognize, is that what's going to end up happening is, as we get into minimum operating standards and or a rating scheme, data centers that are potentially 20, 25 years old will start to fall outside, and the cost of upgrade will be such that it'll be impossible to justify from a business point of view. The return on investment won't justify
Yeah.
it.
I mean,
However,
exactly. If you look at the actual wording of the Large Combustion Plant Directive, basically they were given, they had to put carbon capture and storage for the emissions to calculate, or they were given 20,000 hours of operation. And the carbon capture and storage technology was unviable. So they basically did 20,000 of hours of operation and then shut them down. And but the thing is, looking at it from a different perspective, that's actually good, because what it's done is it's freed up a lot of former coal-fired power station sites that have 400 kilovolt grid connections, which we can use for the AI boom. Yeah.
love it.
So, and in fact, I think Microsoft are building a data center in Lincoln on a former coal-fired power station, and we've got Didcot, which is a former coal-fired power station, and I'm sure they'll be looking at other coal-fired power station sites that are perfect for what they need to do.
Yeah. Thomas, I think you're going to step in.
Yes, I think the only two things I would say is it's important to remember that the data centers don't operate in a vacuum. They do operate in a wider within wider society. And again, going back to the battery directive, which is clearly my area of expertise, if you the level of understanding of battery use in data centers by the people who should have known better in the EU was shockingly poor. They had no understanding that lead acid batteries were used for 10 minutes, for example. They just saw batteries as being car batteries or EV batteries. So it becomes important for the wider DC sector to perhaps educate people outside of their immediate sector. I think that would be my first point. I mean, we as suppliers and other people within the industry immediately put a hand up and went, hold on a second, you need to consider the utilities, you need to consider the data centers. There are lots more people going to be impacted by this regulation than just the EV manufacturers. So I think that would be my first point. I think the second point is we use the same, in terms of influencing, we use the same levers that anybody else does. There are trade associations, there are local political people that we use, and we're trying to influence to ensure that the regulations, once they go into detail, and they will go into detail through harmonized standards, EN 60896 would be one example. Those are influenced, and you're almost, how can I put this? You're within the regulations as laid down, but clearly you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We all have a clear idea of where we want to go, but we don't want this to become ridiculous.
Yeah, and we didn't really discuss this, Michael, but I think it's worthy of being covered. F-gas regulations.
Oh yeah.
So that is a wicked problem that's just over the horizon, to be honest, when you think about it. And that might be one of the mechanisms where those legacy facilities kind of disappear, because they are probably going to be using some of the old refrigerant gases, which with a high global warming potential. So they will need to be refurbished. And I think what will happen is, and I know this for a fact because I've been talking to some of the air conditioning manufacturers, they're basically saying that they're not going to, they will provide transition services if you want to upgrade an existing air conditioning system with a new refrigerant gas, but the cost of it is going to be the same as replacing the entire system. And who's going to do that? Because it's going to be like the coal-fired power stations, as you say, it's going to be too expensive to refurbish and upgrade. And so we might have that churn of legacy facilities just by other regulations that appear. But I was going to mention this before. It's like your car's getting a little bit old, right? So what do? You buy a new car. And maybe some of these old data centers are like an old car that is becoming too costly to run and maintain. So you buy a new car if you can afford it.
Though though I slightly orthogonal to this pitch, this presentation, the only problem I see as someone who was an operator that had a lot of what we call, Gen 1 data centers, is they're typically some of the most densely interconnected sites in the world.
Yeah.
And most of today's mobile and telephone and subsea networks depend upon them to connect us all to the internet, the cloud, and AI. So there will have to be some form of exceptionality, because the transition from one of those data centers to a next generation data center isn't just building a new building and moving clients. It's fundamentally rewiring the global internet. So
Nobody said it was going to be easy,
no,
Michael.
nobody said that was going to be.
Nobody said
That's
it was gonna
something,
be
to be watching out for. I want to move on to a question that came in, partly because I think it moves to an interesting point. Europe has used regulations to drive some fundamental points. I mean, if we think of the big one, GDPR, it fundamentally defined that data resides with the creator, the citizen that made the data, and can never be abrogated to an enterprise, the American model, Facebook, or to the government, the Chinese model, Chinese Communist Party. And that's bluntly what GDPR stated and sanctioned. And in a certain sense, we're doing the same thing with sustainability regulations, which are saying, what are the elements that are causing problems that will keep Europe from hitting its Green Deal objective? On the other hand, Europe is fundamentally less competitive in the technology space than China and America. And someone's raised a question about, does the Trump presidency change things? And I'm going to suggest you do a little bit of a searching for Emmanuel Macron. The heads of Europe meet once a quarter in Brussels, and coincidentally, that was the last meeting was November the 7th, the day after the election was announced. And I thought he was very succinct and actually very inspirational. He basically said, look, the Trump election says that the people of America voted for Donald Trump. They voted for him because they believe that Donald Trump will protect the rights of Americans. There's no more to be said. It's done. He said, our job is to defend the rights of Europeans. And he said, but look at Europe. Europe could be 440 million EU citizens. And if we take a broader definition of Europa, 700 million citizens with a GDP larger than America. And he said, it is time for us to step up and look at how Europe plays on this field. So I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned that there are these regulations coming in place, but the European competitiveness on the world stage is what I think is fundamentally being challenged. Do you expect countries and Europe to change the way they look at business, to be regulated or to be supported for growth?
Well, I've always felt that addressing the climate emergency and the net zero goals would require changes to the business models. And yet, there are some large organizations that have very dated business models, and they have lost their competitiveness and then they disappear. So it's inevitable that business models have to change. So from the conversations I've had with your American partners and other Americans in this space, they're actually expecting more data center regulation from Republicans rather than less. And I think that where Europe leads, the climate change agenda will cascade down to other areas. Or in this case, President Trump or President Trump-elect, he may, he's announced today that he's got the Doge coming in. He's got Elon Musk coming in, to try and do stuff and drill, baby. But I think businesses are kind of already ahead of the curve a bit, and they're not going to do things that are going to impact their reputational risk. So they're going to continue on plans that they've already got in place that are already funded. And, if he wants to pull out of NATO, it's not going to be because of something about X. It's going to be the fact that the Europeans haven't stepped up with their funding commitments. And I think they definitely moves afoot to step up to those funding commitments. But it might have the reverse effect. It might make Europeans' defense industry have a massive boom, against a to compete with the Americans on the world market. But I mean, I think this is probably outside of our topic, to be honest.
Politically dangerous. Mm.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll step back on regulation. And if anything, I think the US and Asia Pac will probably follow the regulations in certain respects. We know that China already have. They've already done, they've used the PUE, which is, you know, as we just discussed, it's the wrong thing to focus on. But they're doing that. And I know that there's moves in various American states to roll back on the tax benefits that some data centers were receiving. And we know from North Virginia and Loudoun County that, you know, some of the plans that are put in place by Dominion Energy and PJM are just not going to fly. So, you know, I think there will be, for all of the rhetoric that we see in the data center related trade press about the AI boom and then data centers being built here, where, there, and everywhere, at the end of the day, there is 100% correlation between data centers and power. And if you don't have power, then you can build as many data centers as you want, but you know it's a wasted exercise because you need to connect them. We do need another energy source. I think that we'll probably end up using SMRs, right? We will, but they're not going to be conventional nuclear SMRs. They're probably going to be the thorium salt reactor types. That's going to accelerate through. You know, there's a lot of permitting and regulation around nuclear, and for a very good reason. Now, whether or not they're going to accelerate that is a question. I suspect they are going to accelerate that. So permitting will be quicker than it would have has been recently announced. The problem is do you have sufficient people within the regulatory regime with nuclear experience that can actually look at some of these reactor designs and say that they are safe? That, I think, is going to be a problem.
Energy definitely is, as far as the European Data Center Association is concerned, energy and energy access is our number one problem. We can handle regulations, but without the energy, there will be no growth. But one of those energy solutions is, of course, secondary energy, like you mentioned, SMRs, could be green hydrogen, could be biofuels, who knows. But Thomas, obviously, large industrial scale battery storage as well. Do you see a role for governments to provide incentive to drive behavior as opposed to regulation? So carrot instead of stick.
Yeah, I think it has to go both ways to promote behavior. It's got to be make commercial sense in one way, and also I think you touched on use regulation to clear some of the hurdles. So effectively, we talked about planning permissions and things like that in order to get certain battery storage available. And I think governments have a role to play there as well to ensure that this green agenda it progresses and isn't held back by regulations, in other areas.
And if I look at the two questions that remain, or at least the first half of the second question on our board here, there is an issue of different national agendas. And the first one specifically points at the UK. I have worked very closely with the Tech UK as part of the European Data Center Association, and they're a member because our basic belief is that the UK is going to have to align with European regulations in general or suffer being treated as outside of a European digital and or carbon border. Thoughts on getting Europe to operate as a more unified entity? Europe, broad Europe, not just European Commission.
Well, we've spoken to Tech UK as well. We're part of the Data Center Council, and we're on the ESG group and the Data Center Skills Working Group. We are also working with DNES and DCIT on separate projects, but our recommendation all the way along, and it's been very consistent, is that we should not diverge too far away from the European regulations as they apply to data centers. So in answer to the question that's been raised there, there is a consultation that's happening at the moment on the environmental restrictions. There's a climate adaptation report that's going to be published in early 25. And I've seen a draft of that, and that is actually quite robust. It's a very good document. We'll probably be launching it at the NDCA actually, but that's subject to Tech UK agreeing to that. So there are regulations at the moment. We fall under the general planning consensus. Will there be any specific data center regulations for build and flood zones? Yes, there will be. It's work in progress, and it will probably be announced as part of the regulatory element to the recent announcement of that data centers are now UK critical national infrastructure. So I was quite amused when everybody started going, hey, it's great, we're part of the critical national infrastructure regime. And I was like, well, hold on a moment, they haven't said anything about how they're going to regulate you yet. So maybe hold fire on that until you see the regulations. But as I said, we've been strongly telling government that they should not move that far away from existing European regulations, because essentially most of the people that are providing the compliance services for Europe are actually based in the UK.
Yeah.
Thomas, you had an interesting anecdote on that.
Well, not interesting might be a bit too far, but I think certainly from CE marking and the move away from CE marking to UKCA, it becomes very, very difficult to explain to perhaps a US audience what the difference is between these two areas. And I think from a supplier's point of view, we just want everything to be in line. You don't want to have something, you don't want to have a piece of equipment that is compliant in France but not in the UK. It wants to be exactly aligned. So I think from our point of view, I think the UK will mirror exactly European compliance for the foreseeable future in almost everything in the spaces that we're in, and I think that's a good thing.
So handing back to the organizers, thank you, Kaylee. I think that, the key thing here is that the regulations are here. They are complex. They're coming in fast and furious. Some of them are contraindicative, and we just need to keep engaging, and we will do that. And I think they are manageable, but they're difficult and perhaps necessary. But thank you very much, everybody.
So thank you so much for that. You've kept that so well, time to type for what you said. Like you said, it's a very emotive and complex question. Yep. So thank you, Michael, John, and Thomas, for joining us and giving us your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.